Hello and happy World Wildlife Day to all of you watching and listening from around the world. My name is Ralica and I am part of YOUNGO's Nature Working Group, which is behind this webinar today. YOUNGO is the official children and youth constituency of the UNFCCC. We are a network of youth organizations and individuals, and we get involved in international climate change policies and actions within the UN system as well as beyond. Today's webinar will focus on the topic of nature conservation, why it's important, and also what are some things that we could do. So we have invited a few amazing conservation experts and activists to share their knowledge and their passion with us. The topics we'll cover today range from the role of soil in supporting ecosystems, then we'll go to the sky and learn about bird biodiversity, followed by the interconnectedness between trees and the orca whale populations in the Pacific Northwest. And lastly, we will go to the changing Arctic, its wildlife, and its people. We'll be introduced to challenges, but also we'll learn about solutions and actions that we can implement. Our hope is that with this brief webinar, you will gain not only a better understanding of the challenges and the importance of wildlife conservation, but that it will also bring you some inspiration in these challenging times, whatever that inspiration looks like for you today. So, without further ado, here are the talks.
All right. Hi there, everyone. My name is Mahnoor Ansari, and I'm going to be talking to you all about the importance of nature conservation for World Wildlife Day and beyond, hopefully. So before I get into that, a little bit about myself. Like I said, my name is Mahnoor. My pronouns are she, her. I'm from Pakistan and the United States. And right now I'm a master's student at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. I study environment and resource management with a specialization in global sustainable futures. I'm also a climate justice committee member for the Young Friends of the Earth in the Netherlands. And before this, I used to work on a really lovely farm in Southern Virginia in the United States. It's located on historically Occaneechi land. And actually that's a place where I really got to cultivate my passion for regenerative agriculture and soil health. So that's kind of going to be a lot of what I'm talking about today. And also a lot of what I learned is through the Land and Leadership Initiative. If you look them up, you can find like really great webinars and courses. So I encourage you to do that if this is something you're interested in. Okay, so what does soil conservation have to do with World Wildlife Day? Typically, when you think of wildlife, you probably think of native fauna and flora. But as you might already know, nature is much more complex and interconnected than that. And this native wildlife is nested within a biome, which is nested within an ecosystem, within this ever-changing hydroclimatic system. And so in order to conserve this wildlife, we need to recognize all this complexity that envelops it, that supports it at all these different scales. And I do that by using living systems thinking as one lens to view the world through. There's many other such lenses, but some of the principles of living systems thinking include interdependence, biodiversity, cooperation and partnership, and circularity. Now I'm, as I said, really passionate about soil health and also about the essential work of the microorganisms that support us all. So these, miraculous microbial communities beneath the soil. Now, here's some facts about soil that you may or may not know already. First, there's this really important layer of soil called the topsoil, which is made up of 5 to 10 inches of the top layer of soil, and it supports plant life, which supports animal life, and it can take up to 1,000 years to produce just 2 to 3 centimeters of the soil, and it's basically the part that we're rapidly degrading. And in just 1 teaspoon of this healthy topsoil, there are more organisms than there are humans on Earth. So it's super rich and dense with life. So it's not just this sort of like non-living substance or medium as we think of it. It's really a living system. And soil also sequesters carbon from the atmosphere, and this also helps retain more moisture in the soil. And this is important for climate change resilience. So if you're thinking about like drought and flood protection, and again, that doesn't just impact humans, that impacts wildlife as well. And having healthy soil can also lead to this thing called evapotranspiration. So it has this really cooling and weather stabilizing effect on the environment. And again, soil is also a source for food. It's a source for shelter and medicine for wildlife. It's really the medium that terrestrial wildlife is nested within. And before we can start conserving this vital soil or this soil sponge, we have to change the discourse around it. So soils and the ecosystems that they support are often viewed through this very extractive, anthropocentric, capitalist, and colonial lens. And sometimes we call them ecosystem services, and this is also like a very human-centric way of thinking about nature. And, as in what can we humans, particularly the wealthiest hegemonies of humans, extract from all this nature and all this wildlife without any respect or reciprocation. And the same approach has been applied to indigenous and marginalized communities throughout history. And it has basically led to the destruction of biodiversity, of cultural heritage, and it is rapidly destroying the planet through things like intensive agriculture, deforestation, and overgrazing, and all of these are quite interconnected. So according to the UNFAO, and that is the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, they say that 33% of the Earth's soils are already degraded, and over 90% could become degraded by 2050. And in soil degradation, it does affect things in a human sense when you're thinking of crop yields. But it disrupts the whole system above and below the soil. So it affects the whole ecosystem, which includes us, which includes wildlife. Okay, so now you might want to know what can we do about this? What can we do to protect nature and wildlife by protecting our soils? First, I think that we need to decolonize our ways of thinking and recognize that we are not above nature. We need to shift the narrative from domination and exploitation to cooperation and regeneration. We need to elevate the powerful voices of arguably the most important stakeholders, and that is Indigenous folks who protect 80% of the world's biodiversity while comprising of only 5% of the world's population. We can also start informing ourselves and supporting our local farmers, particularly farmers who apply the principles of permaculture and regenerative agriculture. You can do this by changing your consumption patterns. And when it comes to food, you can do community-supported agriculture, also just spreading awareness and learning more about these practices and these principles. Yeah, there's also this idea of nature-based solutions, which is becoming quite prevalent. But yeah, ultimately, it will take both structural changes and literally grassroots actions for us to recognize the inherent value, the inherent rights of nature. And I hope that with the rest of the talks here that you feel inspired, to go out there to ask questions and to, really collaborate. Yeah, so, thank you for taking the time to hear me out about this, and have a happy World Wildlife Day.
Hi, I am Julia Kovacs, and I am an ornithologist / conservation scientist. my passion for protecting and getting to know birds has brought me to different places around the world, and I would like to tell you a little bit about the struggles of bird conservation and some of the things you can do to help birds out. I myself am working at the Netherlands Institute for Ecology at the Bird Migratory Station. But I also worked as a conservation officer, for instance, in the Seychelles, and field assistant at many different sites of interest around the world. So I have participated in many projects, and I have overseen what sort of obstacles there are in bird conservation on a global scale. So you have probably heard that globally biodiversity is declining. This decline especially affects birds all around the world. In fact, 40% of the bird species show decline. Around 1,500 species of birds are classified as threatened with extinction, which also means 1 out of 8 species, and the losses are increasing rapidly. What is causing this decline? Decline is a result of many different factors. I believe the easiest way to oversee the drivers of this process is to think with the head of a bird. What do you need as a bird to exist? This is a highly complex question to answer, as we have a wide variety of adaptations all around the world, and every bird is a tiny bit different from the other in what they need for habitat, food, or climatic conditions. But basically, these are the resources that are important for birds: food, habitat, nesting place, which could be included in habitat, social interactions or mates, and connectivity. What is depleting these resources? That's my next question. The question is somewhat easier to answer this time. It's us, people. But in what ways are we depleting resources? I highlighted the interactions between resources and threats with different colors, by red meaning most important drivers and yellow less important drivers. Often these threats do interact with each other and are therefore hard to separate from each other. Habitat destruction and degradation are the most detrimental to birds all around the world by affecting the entire safe space of birds, connectivity, reproduction, food, social interactions. Invasive species is the next one on the list, by affecting food resources, nesting, and habitat. Infrastructure, which is something that is closely intertwined with habitat destruction and degradation, adds additional threats to the environment by making habitats unsafe, losing connectivity, and may alter birds' behavior. Pesticides and agriculture are also important factors by affecting food resources. Wildlife trafficking, which is by nature a smaller scale threat, represents threats that may seem small but can cause significant damage to specific populations or species. And last but not least, climate change. I color this interaction with purple because this is an overarching threat and an interaction that may potentially interact with other threats that I listed above. I'm going to discuss all these drivers in a bit more detail. First, habitat loss and degradation. This is the biggest threat all over the world, not only to birds, but pretty much all animal and plant species. The effects may be so devastating because they concern the entire ecosystem in which a given bird is living. As an example, I would like to name the Seychelles black parrot, as I got the chance to work with this species in the Seychelles in 2017. This bird has an incredibly restricted range, only being found on a tiny island in the Indian Ocean, and above all this, it is highly bound to a very specific palm forest habitat. These birds only like nesting in a certain tree species trunks, so therefore the disappearance of this habitat would wipe out their entire species. This is how important habitat degradation may be for birds. Next one, invasive species. This is one of the hottest topics in my field, as in the last 10 years it has been discovered the overwhelmingly devastating effect of invasive species on their environment. As an example, I worked with Hawaiian honeycreepers on the Hawaiian archipelago, where almost all species of endemic birds are listed as threatened. if not endangered or critically endangered. Out of many threats these isolated birds are facing, invasive species too. They are being predated by non-native invasive species such as rats or cats or mongooses in extensive numbers. Besides that, mosquitoes are also invasive in this region, which spread avian malaria, which is a disease that these birds have no resistance for due to their isolated nature. Our next point is human infrastructure. Human infrastructure inflicted effects are often connected to habitat loss and degradation, often adding to the bad. Hereby I would like to mention glass collisions, in which more than 300,000 birds are known to be killed yearly in Canada, wind turbines which have been long an underestimated cause of bird mortality, and light pollution which often enhances glass collision cases. Pesticides. Pesticides are capable of wiping out birds in a certain habitat in large quantities, and unfortunately many of the really harmful ones are over-the-counter pesticides which you can actually just buy in shops. Neonics are especially dangerous, as one neonic coated seed can kill a songbird. Rat poison or poisons used to kill rodents are also extremely dangerous when used in agriculture, as these may not kill birds directly but are lethal to birds of prey which may feed on the poisoned rodents. Number 5, wildlife trafficking. I indicated wildlife trafficking with a yellow arrow on my graph earlier, but that doesn't mean we don't have to take this threat seriously. In fact, although smaller scale than habitat destruction, wildlife trafficking has the potential to push certain species over the brink of extinction. As it is tied to complex socio-economical contexts, it is incredibly difficult to entangle it. And as my last point, we have arrived to climate change. This is the big one that everybody's talking about these days. Just like I mentioned before, climate change is really the tip of the iceberg here, even though this metaphor might not work the best here. It has the potential to affect all aspects of a bird's life cycle, just like you can see it on the first picture. It can cause complex, detrimental phenological shifts. And what's more, it can also interact with other human-induced threats. So, for instance, the use of pesticides might be enhanced because of a shift in the climate. Just like habitat destruction in many species of birds, which are restricted to a tiny little habitat, or already devastated by human activity. If there is a hurricane which would further devastate their forests, they might actually be able to wipe out the entire population of the given birds. This has happened before in the history of conservation science. So I know this all sounds pretty devastating, but I personally believe in act instead of dwell. So I would like to briefly give you some ideas how you can help to reduce risks to birds in this changing world. Firstly, do citizen science. It enables scientists to know more about these processes. It is fun. In every country there are different citizen science schemes available for which you only need to register, and then you can start uploading data or spotting birds, tracking nests in your environment, etc. Make windows safer. Use stickers to let birds know there is a glass there. Try to make your employer or building manager to implement measures serving bird life. Keep cats indoors. Really, keep your cat indoors. It does not harm your pet, and it does do a huge favor to wildlife. Use native plants. Don't introduce a new problem in the form of a non-native, potentially invasive plant. Also, using native plants may serve birds and other native organisms as a food source. Avoid pesticides. Try to use plants to repel unwanted insects. There are certain plants which might have this potential to actually repel or scare away insects from your garden. Or use products that do not harm birds. Drink shade-grown coffee. As small as this little act sounds, it is a huge deal. Shade-grown coffee may help to create habitats to many, many species of birds. Reduce plastic use. Plastic has never really helped anyone before, so I don't think I need to give any further explanation why that might be harmful for birds. I hope you found this an informative and helpful presentation, and I hope I managed to give you some of my enthusiasm about the topic. I would like to thank you all for your attention, and please feel free to contact me with any questions about this topic. As last, here are some pictures I took during my bird conservation journey so far. It really is so rewarding to work with birds as they come in such an amazing high diversity and they lighten up the day of many. In fact, it was recently shown in a study that watching birds have a significant positive effect on mental health, so something that you might also want to try. Thank you.
Marine biologists are keeping a close eye on an endangered orca off the waters around the southern Gulf Islands.
The most shocking part of this news, though, is that J35, or Tahlequah, is still carrying her dead calf.
There's no indication as to how it died, but since then the mother has been getting weaker and weaker as it tries to carry its dead offspring above the water.
Southern resident whales are already closely monitored because they're endangered. There are only 75 left.
We know what we need to do. You know, we've done a tremendous amount of research, we've done a tremendous amount of planning. We need to do the on-the-ground work. And that's not to say that we don't continue to do research or planning, but we need more investment in on-the-ground work. And if we do that, we can fix these problems. But it's got to happen at a scale that we haven't as of yet been doing.
In the Northwest, we have a unique population of orcas called the southern residents.
We have quite a storied past with orcas. Back in like the 30s, people shot at them because they were in competition for salmon. Then in the 60s and 70s, we rounded them up out of the wild, and now we love them. And these whales are known by name by many, many people.
Orcas are the icon of the Pacific Northwest.
They are a symbol of our region. They are beautiful, wild, intelligent animals.
Orcas are the symbol of the Pacific Northwest. They are a reason that people flock here for tourism. They are famous around the world.
The southern resident orcas are really an icon of the Northwest.
As the apex predator, they rely on the whole system being in good health. And so when orcas start to suffer, it really hits people emotionally. And it's this moment of realization that our overall ecosystem is not healthy.
There are 3 threats to orcas. One is lack of food. There just aren't enough fish anymore. Orcas really love to eat Chinook salmon.
These are a species of orca that are not eating marine mammals, so they're eating salmon, and specifically the Chinook.
Way before Europeans came and colonized the area, there were salmon everywhere, so they had no problem finding plenty of food to eat.
Well, right now, Chinook salmon are in decline here in Puget Sound, and that's due to a host of things.
We started putting dams in the river and logging in upland forested areas, and it really started to degrade the habitat that salmon rely on. And as those salmon populations started to decline, so too did orcas, and they are literally starving to death because we've destroyed salmon habitat and we've filled a lot of their salmon with pollution from the cities and different infrastructure that we have out here.
As our population and region has grown, we've done a lot more paving and a lot more building, and the rain pools on top and it floods off, and all of that runoff, we call stormwater, picks up pollution and it travels into the water.
Toxic chemicals collect in the food that the orcas eat, and then it gets into their blubber, their fat.
Which, for the most part, isn't that big of a deal unless they start suffering, unless they start starving. And when they are starving, they start pulling those fat reserves for nutrients, and then all those toxins are going straight into their bloodstream.
So orcas are some of the most polluted marine mammals on the whole planet.
For orca to be healthy, it's twofold. You need to get their food source back, but you also need to drastically reduce the pollution that's going into their home.
And then the third one is when there's lots of boats around. The noise from the propellers and the engines makes it really hard for the orcas to find the fish that are left.
Trees and salmon are very interconnected. Our ecosystem out here is dependent on healthy forests.
Trees are fantastic for so many reasons, but especially for orcas. One of the things that caused the decline of salmon is that we got rid of a lot of the trees and forests that protect and support salmon habitat.
My name is Rosario Franco. I've been doing restoration for over 20 years. I thought it was just a regular job. It's not. I'm running 5 crews, and we do a lot of education for them, like classes, workshops, because the more you learn, the more you know it's important. You go by nature. Nature teaches you everything, shading the water and also clean the water.
All along rivers, if you have nice, healthy riparian forests there, that protects the rivers from a lot of nasty runoff. It keeps it nice and cool and shaded, which salmon really like, cold water. And it also puts a bunch of large woody debris into the water, basically big branches.
The salmon here, they want cold, clean water. The trees, everything is very important to the salmon here. As well as the salmon are important to the trees. When these fish return to their natal streams, spawn, die shortly thereafter, they're providing key nutrients derived from the marine environment that they're bringing back here. So the two coexist together pretty happily given the right conditions.
Over years, we reduced forests, cut them down, converted the land to agriculture or urban areas. So we come in and replant the trees, and then those help shade the water to cool it down. Water temperature is a limiting factor in the summertime. It gets way too warm for species like the Chinook to survive.
One of our biggest issues in this area is our rain. And so when you have more trees on the ground, those trees suck up a lot of that rainwater and reduce the amount of stormwater runoff.
We don't get what we think of as a river in terms of that meandering pool riffle system without the trees. The salmon use those riffles for spawning. The riffles also create subsurface flow. So anytime that the water goes into the sediments and comes back out again, it's cooled and it reduces the pollutants in the water. So it's actually cleaning the water as it's flowing down the stream.
And that provides nice little habitat refuges where both adults and juvenile salmon will hide from predators and also find snacks as they migrate between spawning grounds and the ocean.
We need to better support those hatching fry, the young salmon. So what we're sort of doing is replacing what would have naturally been here under other circumstances. Something like this should just be full of structure and laws. Big trees like these that fall in. So, a lot of stuff is gone. It's been cleaned up, and yeah, and this whole little back bay here is selected as a location because it's exactly the kind of a spot that juvenile salmon are drawn to. We can easily create shelter for them on their journey back out to the ocean, and every little bit helps. So yeah, even just this one little loop on the river here does make a difference ultimately.
What we do on land matters, and it impacts our orcas and it impacts our salmon.
They can't wait for additional action to happen tomorrow. It needs to happen today.
The more trees we plant, the cleaner, healthier our environment is. It's a very simple action with a tremendous amount of power.
So trees are absolutely important to recovering salmon, and the more trees that we have, the more salmon we'll have, and the more orcas we'll have.
It's our impact that has led to this. It's our impact that can lead us out of this. And it's not just any one person, any one agency, but it's all of us. And we have a lot of work ahead, but we can get there.
We're not going to let these animals go extinct, and it's time to get to work. We got some really exciting news at the end of 2018 that there is a new calf out in the water with these orcas. His name is Lucky, and he just sort of represents a lot of different hopes that people have for this population. It's been really difficult watching these whales for the last 3 years not able to successfully give birth or raise a calf. So Lucky is a very special orca that we're all keeping an eye on and holding out hope for.
I mean, what would the Pacific Northwest be without orcas and salmon and trees? It's hard to imagine.
Hello, and thank you for having me along to this World Wildlife Day webinar. It's a very exciting event, and yeah, I very much appreciate you being invited along to share some thoughts with you. So just to give you a bit of an introduction, my name is Ilona. I'm a lecturer at the Scott Polar Research Institute at the University of Cambridge. Kind of lecturing mostly on human geography, but I also have a background in ecology and the natural sciences. And so today I'm going to be talking to you a bit about youth, the Arctic, and a changing climate, and kind of how these factors interact with wildlife in the region and maybe across the globe as well. So to start off with, let's have a bit of a chat about what the Arctic is. We tend to hold this idea of the Arctic as this kind of great wilderness, it's snowy, cold, harsh, empty, barren, untouched, it's very wild. It's very kind of extreme. And there's aspects of truth in that the Arctic can be very cold, can be very harsh and windswept. But I'd suggest that there's maybe two ways in which this idea that we often hold in our head of the region is a little bit inaccurate. And the first one is this idea of the Arctic being an empty wilderness. The Arctic is very much full of life. It's full of plant life and animal life. Some of these animals stay there year round. You have things like the polar bears who hibernate. You have reindeer and caribou who do huge migrations across the circumpolar Arctic. Things like moose as well. Then you have other animals who migrate there yearly, who come north. Things like various kinds of birds, also whales and fishes. And then of course you have all the plants in the Arctic that come out every summer when the snow goes away, berries and fungi and lichens and so on. And so I would first argue that it's not empty, it's full of life. And my second argument kind of leads on from that not only is it full of animal and plant life, but it's also full of human life. The Arctic is home to 4 million people. And many of those people, the indigenous peoples, have been there for thousands of years. And so this would kind of bring into question the second assumption, that the Arctic is untouched. That in many ways these people who have been living there for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, have been carefully using and transforming and working together with the environment in order to survive there. They've, domesticated or semi-domesticated some species. They've kind of built their communities in certain areas to make use of resources. They've hunted certain animals and not others, and all of these things have changed the makeup of the environment, usually in very sustainable ways. And Dr. Victoria Bushman, who's a conservation biologist, but also Inupiat, so indigenous to Alaska, she has said that conservation is about sustainable and respectful use. Inuit are exceedingly good at both of these. So yeah, my second argument would be that the Arctic is in fact a very carefully managed landscape. It's not untouched. And so maybe keeping these two in mind, we can have a bit more of a discussion of what's going on in the Arctic. I'm sure you know that it's really very much a poster child of climate change. I'm sure many of your news feeds are full of pictures of polar bears kind of clinging onto melting icebergs. And indeed, the Arctic is experiencing very rapid change. When I went to Arctic conferences a few years ago, everyone would start their talk by saying that the Arctic is warming at twice the rate compared to the rest of the planet. Unfortunately, now we know that's not true. It's in fact warming at 3 times, or in some places even 4 times, at the rate compared to the rest of the planet. So it's really experiencing very fast changes. And this has huge impacts on the wildlife. For example, the melting of sea ice can prevent some species from being able to migrate during wintertime because they don't have this solid surface to walk on. And it can also affect the ability of animals to hunt and get food. This includes things like polar bears, but also providing resting places for animals like walruses. And it really kind of affects their ability to get food and rest and maintain their energy. Changes in the Arctic in the sea are also causing animals to move in different ways. So, for example, in the oceans, many fish have changed their migratory patterns or are moving to kind of cooler areas of the ocean. And this affects everything up in the food chain that relies on those fish. So, larger fish, whales, but also land-living creatures that rely on these fish. And of course, we often think of climate change as warming, but it's also a kind of an increase in erratic or extreme weather. And these extreme weather events have been happening across the Arctic as well. Often kind of huge fluctuations between hot and cold temperatures that has caused really huge areas to kind of freeze and turn to ice instead of snow. And there's been many examples in the last few years of thousands or tens of thousands of reindeer or muskox starving to death because of these kind of extreme weather events preventing them from being able to dig to get food. And so as we can see, changes in the Arctic are having really big effects on wildlife, but that's also affecting people, that people rely on many of these species for food. And so when these animals are affected, then the people who rely on them for food are also affected. They're losing these sources of food. Not only that, but changes in the physical landscape is kind of making life difficult. You know, we're seeing sort of entire communities being washed into the sea because the sea ice is melting, and preventing the kind of protection from erosion that the coastlines need. And not only are kind of plants and animals experiencing physical changes and humans experiencing kind of social and cultural and economic changes, but there's also really big kind of emotional and even spiritual changes going on because of all this transformation in the Arctic region. So as we can see, it's really very problematic for wildlife and for the people who rely on that wildlife. And so what do we do about that going forward? How do we kind of protect and mitigate and maintain a healthy ecosystem? Well, I would suggest one way to do that is to look at the people who understand the region. Silawat Cloutier, who's a former president of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, has said, "We're not looking for," so she's saying this of the Inuit, "we're not looking for people to solve our problems. We may be the most vulnerable to all of these monumental changes, but we are still a people of great dignity and pride. We have much to offer in understanding the crisis our climate is in and in offering solutions." But I would suggest that we often have this habit of really separating humans and the environment, or humans and wildlife. We're used to seeing these documentaries where people are just completely detached from the environment. It's just animals living in this wild, wild world. But in reality, humans and animals have been interacting for thousands of years and affecting one another in negative ways, but also quite often in positive ways. And so if we look to many of those people who have been having those positive relationships with nature, there's a lot that we can learn and we can do together to kind of develop solutions and plans. And you know, this isn't just restricted to the Arctic. There's a really interesting statistic that indigenous peoples make up less than 5% of the world's population, but they're responsible for protecting 80% of global biodiversity. So high biodiversity areas are vastly tend to be in areas of indigenous homelands and indigenous run or governed, or areas where indigenous peoples reside. And so really across the planet, they play a very important role in already protecting biodiversity and wildlife. Not only have they been doing that in their day-to-day lives for hundreds and thousands of years, but also in recent years they've been kind of becoming incredibly vocal in trying to protect wildlife from new changes and new challenges. There's kind of a really strong activist community amongst many indigenous peoples, kind of creating, not only kind of going to rallies and marches and so on, but indigenous people have been creating political bodies and taking various groups to court who have not been fulfilling their responsibility to the environment. Now, a really important subgroup of this, I would suggest, is the youth. That indigenous peoples in general have a lot to offer, but especially the youth. And we've seen a lot of youth really kind of standing up to safeguard wildlife. We've seen that not only among indigenous youth, but if you look at the school strikes, there's an incredible kind of energy among young people and concern for the natural world. And among the kind of indigenous youth as well, that they've been kind of forming bodies and making speeches and governing their local communities in ways that protect and maintain wildlife, taking part in research projects, creating nature-based solutions to these problems, and doing a lot of advocacy and education. You can see that as well in the podcast at the bottom there. It's a really amazing podcast that some Arctic youth have been making. And Arctic youth hold a very special position, especially indigenous youth. Generally they're incredibly innovative and also incredibly diverse yet interconnected. Indigenous peoples and indigenous youth across the planet have been really amazing at building links between themselves, because although they often reside with different cultures, different languages, in very different parts of the world, in very different environments. They've found points of solidarity and ways of learning from one another and how they can carry out their activism and their education. So it's kind of a real strength of the youth of that region. Not only that, but Indigenous youth are often incredibly knowledgeable about their environment and kind of their traditional culture, but at the same time knowledgeable about the dominant culture within which they often reside. We often call it a Western culture. And so they're kind of bridging the gap between what you might say are these two different worlds. And so they hold a really important role in translating these different worlds for one another. More than all that, though, there's just an incredible energy and care and drive that really the will is there to share the knowledge and protect the wildlife and the environment. But we just need to let there be a way. We need to create more spaces where youth in general, but especially Indigenous youth and in the Arctic Indigenous youth, we need to create spaces for them to not only kind of share their knowledge, but also be innovative, create plans, create practical action, and to then, carry that action forward. And that's kind of, I guess that's sort of where I want to finish this talk, that I know this is a webinar about wildlife, and wildlife is really kind of the crux of all of this, but we need to remember as well that we are not separate from our environment, and that when we look at kind of the negative things that we have done to the environment, the negative impacts that humans have had on wildlife, I think it's very important to also remember the positive impacts humans have had, so we can reach out and use that knowledge and that those kind of innovative forums to find these solutions and mitigations to a changing environment. So with that, I will stop. I'll say thank you very much for having me along, and I look forward to hearing how your discussions go.
Hi, my name is Ryan Zlatanova. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am speaking to you today from traditional Piscataway and Manahoac ancestral territory that was taken from these Native nations as a result of colonization. And this land is also known as Northern Virginia in the USA. I am a Bulgarian conservationist currently working in the United States. And I want to wish you a happy World Wildlife Day. I think despite the really difficult things that are going on in the world, including the war in Ukraine, the persecution of the Ukrainian people, we need to take a moment and be thankful for the natural world around us and everything that it gives us. Sometimes that's all that we have. And so I want to take today to talk to you a little bit about the importance of the conservation of nature, the conservation of wildlife, of ecosystems, not only why that's important for the planet, but why that's important for us as people, for our communities, for our families. So let me start by saying something that you may have heard before, something that you may have thought about yourself, which is that it's all connected. We as humans, to survive, need a couple of basic things that all come from nature. We need clean air, we need clean water, we need good, clean, healthy soil in order to grow a lot of our food. We can't go without these things. Technology is really not far along enough for us to be able to go without them, and I hope that it never gets that far. So the other thing that we need to recognize, and I think we've been thinking about this more and more since the COVID-19 pandemic started, is that our health, human health, is very intertwined with nature still. First, let's not forget how much of our medicine is based on nature, takes inspiration from plants, from natural processes that have eventually led to some of the big medical breakthroughs that we have. Let's not forget that COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease. It jumped to humans from wild animals, and we will be seeing a rise in zoonotic disease emergence the more that we destroy nature. Because the reality is there are a lot of viruses, other diseases that are out there in nature, in animals, and we simply don't come into contact with them frequently enough. But as we cut down forests, as we push animals to lose their homes deep into the forest or somewhere that is far from human settlement, we will come closer into contact with wild animals. Our livestock will come into contact with wild animals more frequently, and therefore there will be a lot more opportunities for disease to jump over to humans. Then there's, of course, the matter of nutrition, of healthy, plentiful food. Again, we absolutely rely on nature for that. And the thing is that ecosystems in nature, humans are not outside of them. Humans rely on them. And you've probably heard this many times, that ecosystems, food webs, there are many connected links in a big network. And when one link is missing or is weak, is not doing well, the whole system can start to limp or to collapse. And so, for example, we may think that the conservation of animals, tiger, elephant conservation, or the conservation of your native biodiversity wherever you are, if it's not elephants, for example, here in America, the conservation of bears or of moose, we may think that that is separate from other sustainability issues, for example, like plastic pollution, or we may even think that that's separate from climate change and its effects, but it's really not. These things, they're all interwoven, because when plastic pollution affects over 2,000 animal species negatively, and when over 90% of seabirds probably ingest plastic, those are all species in ecosystems that are suffering. And when that species in an ecosystem is suffering, the whole of the ecosystem can suffer. And we as humans are part of that ecosystem. So all of these issues are connected, and climate change's effects are not just on people or just on animals. There are cascading effects. When one thing is affected, the rest are as well. So we need to think of the conservation of nature as the really holistic and broad matter that it is, and integrate solutions that will hit all of the different issues within the entire matter. I want to show you some quick statistics from WWF's Living Planet report from 2020 that are quite alarming. I don't want them to leave you hopeless, but I think they're important to know for what I'm going to say next. So I'm just going to share my screen. So WWF's 2020 Living Planet report showed that 1 in 5 plants are threatened with extinction, that there is a 68% decline in vertebrate populations, that 500,000 insect species are threatened, and that's a crisis that, frankly, we don't understand well enough yet. That 75% of land around the world has been changed in some way, and the biggest driver of that is converting land from natural land to agricultural land. and 1 in 3 freshwater species are threatened. These are difficult statistics to swallow, and they will probably keep getting worse for a while. The world is taking action. We are seeing some movement, but not enough. And I know that us young folks are often some of the loudest canaries in the coal mine, saying, hey, I want my planet to be in better shape when I am your age. I want my planet to be livable, and we need to keep saying that. We can be drivers of innovation, and we can change minds. We have that power. So I want to encourage us to keep the importance of nature in mind, to remember why nature is important to us culturally, spiritually, for our health, for our well-being, food, clean air, clean water, for the well-being of ecosystems. I hope we can continue to keep that in mind, and we can keep an eye out, even starting just in our small community, friends, family, school. You know, the more that we can talk to people and spread the message of why conservation is important, that's where it starts. Then we can keep an eye on what policies, what legislation are happening in our local communities or in our broader, national, federal, state communities, on the world stage, and see, hey, is there an opportunity for me to do something here? Is there an opportunity for me to say something here and push for a better world? Is there an opportunity for me to bring my friends together and push for something? That's how it happens. It's the collective action that is going to change things. And if we don't keep raising our voices, things just won't change. What's that quote from the Lorax? Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, the world's not going to change. It's just not. So I want to thank you for tuning in to this webinar today. And I wish you a great rest of your day.
And we have reached the end of our webinar today. Thank you for sharing this time with us. We hope this was informative and motivational. Please share with us your highlights or get in touch. You have our social media information here, or you can also get in touch with us through YOUNGO. Thank you to our amazing speakers. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise and your passion with us today. And continuing from Ryan's words, and as we have learned from the other talks, there are many opportunities for us to act. That's very important to remember. And our collective action is where our power to bring about change lies. Thank you and have a great day.